This is the Blood Red podcast from the Liverpool Echo, giving you the inside track on all the big talking points from Anfield.
Hello and welcome along to this week's Liverpool.com podcast. I'm Matt. Addison and Michael Plant is alongside me, and we're going to have a bit of a chat about Conor Bradley and Jeremie Frimpong and the FA Cup as well, in a week where there's been bad news for Conor Bradley, certainly better news for Liverpool in that they've qualified for the fourth round where they'll take on Brighton. But before we get stuck into all of that, don't forget to get the best discount off your NordVPN plan. You can go to nordvpn.com/bloodred. Our link gives you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and the link with the information, I should say, is in the podcast episode description box below. Let's get stuck into it, though, Michael. It's obviously not the best news to have to discuss in terms of Conor Bradley. I know you're a big fan of him. He's been unlucky as well with lots of little injuries, but unfortunately for him, it's a big injury this time. He's confirmed today as we record this podcast that he has now had the surgery from that injury that he picked up against Arsenal. There was lots of discussion about the melee and Gabriel Martinelli and all of that sort of stuff, but the big news for Liverpool is that he's going to miss the rest of this season. And when you consider how few defensive options they've got there, it's really not good news for the player or for the club.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's obviously a huge disappointment for Conor Bradley, a player who has had his injury issues, of course, and you just felt was maybe starting to get into a bit of a rhythm and a bit of routine. Had put together, I think, 2 90-minute displays, was obviously on the verge of another one, although I think actually technically came off an injury time, so they technically register 90 minutes. But and it's just a real shame the timing for him, obviously, particularly as well. You know, obviously we're talking about the club aspect, but in terms of international, he's got the possibility of a World Cup on the horizon as well. That he's certainly not going to be involved in the playoffs in March, and I just think for him, it's just such a shame at this stage of the season. And he's been building up. Like, I mean, I did a big feature on Conor Bradley at the start of the season, talking about how basically his whole career been leading to this season. The fact that Trent Alexander-Arnold has moved on, the fact that he had the opportunity now to cement himself as first choice right back. And it almost felt just at the moment that he was getting that, he's had this very cruel injury, which is a real shame for him. And I suppose we both send him our best wishes and hope that he's back as soon as possible. But then in terms of the team, as you rightly says, it leaves him with just one right back for the rest of the season. That's Jeremie Frimpong, a player who I think there's a question mark about whether he is actually a right back. And it leaves Liverpool with 6 defenders going into the second half of the season. I've written a feature this morning just talking about how it is simply not enough options. They have to, in my eyes, add reinforcements in the market. It looks unlikely at this stage anyway that they're going to do that. I think that would be a mistake personally. I mean, I'm interested to get your opinion on it, but I think that, they need to add an extra defensive option. What's your thoughts? Do you agree that they need to strengthen in the market?
Well, without wanting to make myself extremely unpopular in the comments section, not necessarily. Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to disagree with anything you've said there in terms of a limited number of options. I think when people say that they've just got to buy somebody or they've got to do something, I don't necessarily agree with that completely. Now, if the right player was available and if they decided to go for Mark Gay and decided that whatever price Crystal Palace would put on him this month, they could go and do that, then yeah, absolutely. But I think the evidence of the past suggests that Liverpool won't just do a short-term thing whenever it has happened. Obviously, Ben Davies and Ozan Kabak in the infamous January, that's the obvious one where they have eventually relented to just needing to do something. I think both of those moves were, if not on deadline day in January, then certainly in the last few days of that window. Obviously didn't particularly work out for them, didn't really go the way that they thought it was going to go with those two players. So it depends, I think, in terms of my specific opinion, what you mean by they have to do something. I don't think it'll be the case that they go and buy a player that we've never heard of that they use for the rest of this season and then just sort of bin the player off in the summer. A, because it's just not something they do, and B, it's just not that simple. If you buy a player, you're not going to give him a 6-month contract. Chances are you're probably not going to get some player on loan to be able to come in and do that. I think the way that Liverpool will look at it is probably more bigger picture and think that if it means the next 4 or 5 months they have a bit of short-term pain where maybe the season doesn't end in the way that we hope it will, and we're going to talk about chances of silverware and what the rest of the season might look like a little bit later in the podcast. I get why people are desperate for that, but I do just think it's much, much, much more likely, and I can understand, even though a lot of people won't understand it, I can understand why they might think, do you know what, if we don't have Conor Bradley and we don't get anybody in, we should probably still finish in the top 4. We might be able to do something in the FA Cup or maybe the Champions League, even without a signing, and then we can do what we actually want to do in the summer. I just feel like that's the most likely scenario from this point, but I don't necessarily think that would be a mistake. Now, maybe in the next game, Ibrahim Konate gets injured, Virgil van Dijk gets sent off, and then suddenly it all collapses. But
and you're in at centre-back next week.
Yeah. But then, I just feel like it's a risk. Undoubtedly, it's a risk. But the circumstances Liverpool are in, I don't really see them panicking or doing something that takes them away from that long-term plan.
I agree with the sentiment that Liverpool can't just panic buy and just get anyone in just purely to fill the numbers. I agree it's got to be someone who fits the criteria of the quality of player that Liverpool have got. It's probably also got to be some long-term longevity in that signing as well. I fully understand that, but I don't believe that there isn't a player out there in the January window. And I do think that the possibility of 6-month loan also isn't necessarily the worst case scenario if you're just going to get someone in short term just for an extra body. And I mean, a point I made in last week's podcast, Liverpool wanted to bring Mark Gahey in the summer. Of course, we know they wanted to have 9 defenders for the season. We're down to 6 for the second half of the season. It's simply not enough numbers. And I understand that some people will look at Szoboszlai, Endo, who can play in these positions. But there's even Calvin Ramsey, who, has never played a Premier League match and suddenly might have quite a big second half of the season for Liverpool, which is quite incredible, really. But all these players, Ramsey probably isn't up to scratch, let's be honest. And the other 2, well, then you're taking away from also the limited midfield options. And that's another problem as well. So, we spoke about it in the last week's podcast that they simply just don't have the numbers in general at the moment. And I just think that they need to bring in another one. And it's no exaggeration to say that it could be the difference between making the Champions League or not, between going an extra round in the Champions League or not, in terms of fatigue levels, but also in terms of just having those extra options for Slot to choose from. And I think this is one that I think it'd be a huge, huge mistake to limp across, the finish line of this season with just 6 defenders for the final couple of months of the campaign. And yeah, I understand what you were saying, but I just think they have to identify a target in the next couple of weeks and bring him in.
I can understand that. I just think in the wider transfer picture for Liverpool, the evidence that we've had from the summer is that they want to buy the very best in class. When you look at Alexander Isak, was the best number 9 that they could get out there. Hugo Ekitike, probably the best up and coming, kind of next best, if that makes sense. You look at Giovanni Leone, obviously not seeing a great deal of him, but from what people in Italy have said, the next big thing coming through. Every player that they bought, whatever position, has the ceiling to go right to the very top. And I just think that's the way that Liverpool are going to look at it. I think if they go and get a 7 out of 10 right back now to cover for Conor Bradley, for instance, well, then you've got Bradley, Frimpong and whoever that is beyond the summer. I don't think that really makes sense. If you go and get a 7 out of 10 centre-back now, does that mean that if Mark Gahey doesn't leave this January and he does go on a free in the summer, then maybe is the not the space then to do that? I do wonder about the knock-on effect. I mean, so many people got very, very excited that Liverpool managed to spend as much as they did in the summer, but the reason that they could spend that money in the summer was because they hadn't spent it in the January or the summer before that. There's a limited amount of money that they've got to spend and a limited resource that they have to play with. I wouldn't want to see them, and I don't think they will, get somebody in now that stops them doing the 5-year plan. We've spoken so many times, in terms of Isak, when he came in, Arne Slot said in lots of his press conferences, we've bought him for 5-6 years, not 5 or 6 months, and we've got to be patient with that. I just think that's the approach that they'll take here as well. If the next 4 months are painful, but then Liverpool win 2 out of the next 3 Premier League titles because they've signed Mark Gahey and they've done 2 or 3 things in the summer that they couldn't maybe have done now, longer term, they will look at that and think that that's the right way. But at the same time, I completely get, your maybe less confident than I am that Liverpool will finish in the top 4 this season, for example. And if they were to drop out of that, clearly that would change the picture significantly as well.
My concern would be with the top 4 that Liverpool have had an opportunity over the last 3 or 4 weeks to actually pull clear of the chasing pack, and they've drawn 3 in a row. Now that gap between 5th and 15th is so tight, and obviously there's only a couple of points. I think it's at 2 points. Liverpool are ahead of Brentford in 5th. Of that chasing pack, 1 or 2 are going to go on a really good run in the second half of the season. I think Liverpool are going to have to go on a really good, decent run between now and May if they are going to secure a top 4 finish. Once we factor in the Champions League and how many games that is, the limited numbers that the Slot has got to call upon, the fatigue levels, and also just generally, you want different options for different games, for different opponents as well. And you probably want a specialised, ideally a specialised right back, which I think there's a question mark about whether Liverpool have, but certainly specialised defenders. I think if they brought Guehi in and pushed Gomez more into a right back role, I think that would be acceptable, for instance. But I think it could be the differences to say between potentially silverware or not, and making the Champions League or not. But what I completely agree with what you're saying is they can't just get anyone in just for the sake of it for the final couple of months. I absolutely agree with that. But it's interesting, and look, it's a big conversation really around Liverpool, and they have been very unfortunate to have 2 long-term defensive injuries. I think most clubs would start the season and look at 8 defenders and say that's acceptable numbers. I think certainly 8-9 is roughly the number you would expect. And they've just been unfortunate, Liverpool, in this regard, and it might just force them into a bit of action in the window. I suspect that they probably won't, if I'm honest with you. But I think the obvious answer is Mark Guehi. Assuming the price isn't absolutely ridiculous, it does just feel like the obvious answer is to pay the money. The same logic that you said, that you're buying a player for 5-6 years, would potentially justify actually that paying that price for Mark Guehi, who I think any question marks about whether he had the quality. I remember you and I discussing it in the summer, whether he had the quality to come in and play for Liverpool. I think his performances this season have completely dispelled those worries. Actually, I really do think he would be a brilliant option, particularly, of course, if Konate moves on in the summer as well. So, look, there's so much going on in terms of the defensive numbers. But one player I did want to ask you about and get your opinion on is Jeremie Frimpong, because he's a player who I really like. Think he's done really well over the last couple of weeks. Slot implied that he is now going to obviously play a lot more right back. I don't think that he's the world's greatest detective to work that one out. I just wonder what you think of him in general, what his performances, and perhaps then playing in that right back role going forward across the rest of the season.
Yeah, I've written something actually that's going to go overnight as we record this podcast on Jeremie Frimpong, because I think it is a big opportunity for him. As you say, Arne Slot has basically said that he is the one. He actually said specifically that he doesn't want to play Dominic Szoboszlai at right back. He's had to do that at times this season, but obviously Frimpong is the preferred option. Calvin Ramsey, again, might play here and there, but I don't think anybody would make the case that he is next in line or anything like that. So yeah, it's an opportunity for Frimpong. I don't think I've seen enough of him yet in a Liverpool shirt at right back to make me completely convinced by him. He's obviously been injured. He's then come back and played really well in the last month or so, but that's generally been further forward. Even against Barnsley, I thought he was pretty good, but it was more the good stuff was at the top end of the pitch rather than defensively. I think there's still a few questions. So, is there a good player there? Yes. Is he a right back or a right winger? I think he's probably somewhere in between. I'm not quite sure in terms of that just yet. But the one thing I think we will know before the end of this season is he a genuine option to play at right back? We know when Liverpool bought him, they saw the versatility. They saw the fact that, Mohamed Salah was going to go to AFCON and maybe he could be an option to play there. I think that has proven to be true. But there's a bit of a question mark over me, but I'd like to see, every single week, Jeremie Frimpong playing in that right back position. That's basically the only way we're going to get a definitive answer one way or the other, isn't it? Is that his best position, and is he good enough in that position for Liverpool? Well, we're about to find out, aren't we? So yeah, we will soon see, I think is the answer.
Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of what you've just said there, really, in terms of his attacking qualities seem to outweigh his defensive qualities. I thought particularly the first half against Barnsley really summed him up, where he was brilliant going forward. How many times does he just stand the player up and then just knock the ball? And he's so fast. No one is ever going to keep up with him. He obviously scored an absolutely brilliant goal. I think got overlooked just how good it was, him cutting in his left like that. And he put in, look, he creates lots of opportunities. His final ball's lacking a bit at times, and some of his crosses, particularly in the Leeds match a couple of weeks ago, were lacking. And that's something to work on, I think. But on the flip side, Barnsley had a lot of attacks down their left flank, Liverpool's right. And there was once or twice where Frimpong pushed up so much, there was a big gap there to be exploited. And there was one in particular where he miscontrolled it and allowed one of their players in. I think, what was the lad who played left wing for Barnsley who was very good?
I can't remember, but he was.
I can't remember.
Think if that helps.
Yes. So anyway, but and listen, he had a great evening up against Frimpong, and listen, Frimpong is, as you just said, I think he's proving to be a real asset going forward. Actually, a player who I think even in the last couple of weeks since he's come back from injury, I've already kind of slightly made my mind up on that. I think Liverpool have really brought in a very good player. I just think the question mark is, what position is he? And obviously, predominantly at Leverkusen, he played as a wing back, where, so he's somewhere in between. And I do think that seems to be his position, I suspect. But as you said, we're going to get lots of opportunities to see it over the course of the rest of the season. I do think he'll play right wing a little bit. Obviously, when Salah comes back, you would expect him to predominantly play there. But I can see a scenario where for some games, Gomez comes in at right back and Frimpong's pushed further forward as well. So, but yeah, it's certainly, a player we're going to see a lot more of. And actually, also, just on the side note, seems like a really nice guy. Stopped in the mix zone a couple of weeks ago. Always seems to be doing interviews for the club, which I always just think is a really good characteristic of a player, and comes across as a kind of a really affable guy who does a lot of charity work in the Northwest as well. And yeah, I think he's been a real addition already to the Liverpool squad.
I think the most obvious thing with him is his pace, and obviously in the final third that helps. That's something that Arne Slot has spoken about at length this season, of wanting more injections of pace. When Liverpool come up against a low block, even though it didn't quite happen, as you say, against Leeds, I think there's definitely quality there that it would be worth having on the pitch in those kinds of games. I also think defensively, even if he isn't the most perfect of defenders all of the time, the fact that he is so quick, if a player does beat him or get him behind him, there's half a chance he can get back and make up for whatever potential error there might be as well. So, yeah, as I say, we will find out the answer of whether he is the answer at fullback or not moving forwards. Joe Gomez as well, probably worth a quick chat on him. You mentioned him in terms of a right-back option. Again, he's another one that you'd say, well, absolutely, play him at centre-back, play him at right-back, but it is a bit of a worry, isn't it, that he is one of the available options at the moment. He's not always going to be available. I think history would tell us, and certainly he's not going to play every week. So, I mean, would you play Joe Gomez maybe in the bigger games, the away games? What kind of plan would you have for him at right-back? What edge do you think he has over Jeremie Frimpong in those kind of fixtures?
Well, I think obviously defensively he is better. I don't think anyone would argue with that. I do think he is best at centre-back, and I do think that his versatility is brilliant. I think what would be interesting about him playing a right-back is perhaps then can you have a system where slightly in possession you're almost a back three with Gomez, Konate, Van Dijk, and it allows Kirkes a bit more leeway to bomb on, which was kind of his best asset at Bournemouth, that ability to drive forward down the left. So I think that could be a slight tactical tweak that could arise from Bradley's injury, actually, and could get the best out of Kirkes, a player who is definitely kind of slowly improving over the last weeks and months. And I think just to come back to the initial point we said, I spoke about having 6 defenders, when one of them is Joe Gomez as well, who is a very good player. But as you said, it has been proven he cannot be relied on to be fit. I would be amazed if we go through between now and the end of the season and Gomez is fit for the entire campaign. So there's potentially a situation where you're getting into 5 available defenders. No, that's a lot of ifs and buts and whatever, but they just need to bring in a defender this month. But yeah, what do you think about Gomez playing kind of right back? What do you think he would add to the team compared to Frimpong particularly?
I almost wouldn't have any issue in any of the games, to be honest, even if it was a low block team. Yeah, okay, it makes more sense to have Jeremie Frimpong there, but like you say, it might offer the chance on the other side if Gomez tucks in. Maybe we see a little bit more of Kirkes, who I think is another one who's looked a little bit better in the last few weeks. I've been more and more impressed by him. He looks like he's settled down a little bit and is a little bit more comfortable in his surroundings, I would say. So yeah, I'd have no problems with Joe Gomez playing. The problem is, that if he starts one game and does well, you probably can't play him in the next game just to keep his fitness and make sure that he stays fit. So it's kind of a half solution, isn't it, in a way, really? If he does well, fantastic, but it doesn't necessarily mean he's going to play 5 of the next 6, because I just don't think that is something that he is capable of doing. Now, Liverpool not in the League Cup, so there's less games in that, but they are in the FA Cup and Champions League, so there's going to be opportunities for Joe Gomez, but it's just a case of picking and choosing. I think that the games that he does, and maybe it's even a case of Jeremie Frimpong does 60 minutes or however long it was he did against Barnsley, and then you swap him out and manage him a bit more like that. Now, that relies on Liverpool being a couple of goals up, maybe on 60, which we haven't seen too many times this season. But if they can get into that position, I think that's probably the best way of managing those minutes. And that leads us nicely to the other competitions and the rest of this season. I mentioned it at the top that Liverpool obviously play Brighton at home next in the FA Cup. Now, it could have been an easier game. Personally, I'm just glad it's a home game rather than having to go all the way to Brighton. But it's one of those, isn't it, that the FA Cup where in a normal season, it's probably the 3rd, if not the 4th priority in terms of the competitions. But the way that Liverpool are this season, it does feel like a real chance for them to go far in that competition, even though Brighton next is not going to be easy. Probably Arne Slot has to have an extra little eye on that competition this season, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah, and I think we saw that with the team selection against Barnsley. I know he did reference that he didn't have the options, which there's some truth to, but he definitely could have made a few more changes, I think. I think it was very important that he had Virgil van Dijk in there, for instance, kind of setting the standard. He obviously had Szoboszlai, who had a very mixed night, shall we say. But still, I watched it back, that moment even yesterday, just trying to work out what he was doing. But it was bizarre. One of the most bizarre things I've ever seen in a football pitch, I think. But yeah, it's a real competition now that they've got to take seriously, and they've got to. I think there's an argument to say that it should be the biggest focus. Not quite a stance I would necessarily agree with, but I think it is definitely their best chance of silverware this season. And I've said a couple of times that this is a transitional season for Liverpool. If a transitional season turns into FA Cup victory and getting top 4, actually that's a very good transitional season. If they drop out of the top 4 and don't win silverware, then there are bigger questions I think to ask. So the FA Cup could be pivotal for the success of Liverpool's season. Is it an exaggeration to say Arne Slot's long-term future in the role? I don't think so, but yeah, I think the FA Cup is a competition that should have huge significance. But as you said, they've really not been handed an easy draw in the 4th round. I think Brighton have gone under the radar, actually, how good they are this season, and they're going to prove to be a really difficult test. Slot repeatedly mentioned in the last couple of weeks, them Villa, how they set up against Liverpool that made it quite easy for Liverpool to play. So maybe they are the ideal opponent. What do you think about it all in general?
Yeah, it's not the easiest draw, is it? I think you've got to fancy Liverpool at home, as you say, against the team that will play like that. But I suppose they are one of those teams. Liverpool are one of them, Brighton are another, where they will be looking at the FA Cup and thinking it's an opportunity for them to go far. In the league, I think there's a limitation to what maybe Brighton can do. Maybe that's slightly unfair when you look at certainly what Villa are doing, and maybe would be able to take that next step at some point. But certainly for this season, Brighton are not going to get into the Champions League. They're not in Europe, I don't think, are they, this season? So they're going to have an opportunity in the FA Cup to go far. Now, they're probably looking at it and thinking, well, we've got one of the worst possible draws as well. So you could probably look at it from their perspective that they're not too happy with it. But I'm sure the one thing we can guarantee is that they will play a strong team and really go for it. I think Liverpool have to as well. And like you say, I was glad that Liverpool played as strong a team as they did against Barnsley, because if Virgil van Dijk wasn't there, if he didn't have the experience, say, of Andy Robertson, if Jeremie Frimpong wasn't there, Dominic Szoboszlai was excellent apart from the moments of madness. Barnsley looked pretty good, and that could have been a shock, particularly when they hit the post after about 30 seconds and looked pretty good in that first few minutes. So yeah, it was a good sign. I think that Arne Slot took it more seriously. I'd expect an even stronger team the next time around. And if Liverpool can get through, it's easy to look at it now and think, oh, they've got Brighton in the next round, but it could be, a Championship or a League One team in the 5th round. Or a lot of this, I think, will come down to the look of the draw, as it always does, and the same in the Champions League as well. But yeah, certainly for me, feeling relatively secure in terms of Liverpool getting back into the Champions League. I think they can afford to go a little bit stronger in those other competitions and just see what happens. If they can beat Brighton, then there'll already be other teams who have been knocked out. I think there's a couple of all Premier League ties. There's going to be teams who are knocked out in that next round, and before you know it, it can start to open up. So yeah, it's an opportunity for Liverpool. I think it's a lot more important. I would always pick the League Cup at the start of the season because it is over earlier and it basically finishes before the other competitions really start to kick in. But without a doubt, from this point in the season, Liverpool have to go and attack the FA Cup. I think it just makes sense in the context.
I think it's a good point what you said. There's really a couple of teams out. I mean, Man United and Spurs. I mean, how much of a threat they are these days, really. But Palace are out. I mean, Everton. I mean, always going to be a difficult game for Liverpool. If they were to get them in the FA Cup, but of course they're out. One of Villa or Newcastle are going to go out in the next round as well. So you start already looking at it and thinking, actually, there's quite a few teams there that are going to be threats to Liverpool potentially winning the competition that are already out. So I listen, it's a great opportunity to go and win silverware, and it would, as I said previously, it would completely change the perspective of the season if they can go and win a trophy. And I think Arne Slot would probably breathe a lot easier heading into the summer, I suspect, as well. And the concern would be that the deeper they go into the FA Cup. I still think the Champions League is one they can win as well, but what I think maybe I'm coming around to thinking more and more is that I just don't know if they're going to have clicked into gear enough. I would maybe have expected to see more in terms of performances to give me real belief that they could go on and win the Champions League. Because we're kind of 2 months out now from the last 16 begins in 2 months, doesn't it? I mean, Liverpool will hope that they're going to bypass the playoffs as well. So I still don't know if there's enough there. The performances, particularly against Europe's absolute best, I think that Liverpool at this stage can go toe-to-toe, particularly over two legs. We'll see. But yeah, so for that reason, again, the FA Cup looks like a one they can really potentially, put a lot of effort and energy towards. But I am, just to take you back to one thing you said, can I just ask, why are you so confident in Liverpool getting the top four finish?
Basically, because I don't trust the teams below them to be consistent enough. I think there is still a question mark over Liverpool, but I just don't see Manchester United as a team that's suddenly going to click into gear and be much better. I don't think Chelsea are in a position. You look down the table and think, I'd be shocked if any of those teams below Liverpool now ended up finishing above Liverpool. Now, that's not because Liverpool are amazing and Liverpool have suddenly played much better, even though they have been significantly better than they were. They're still not anywhere near to the levels that they need to be at. I just struggle to make the case for anybody overtaking them, and I just feel like it's going to be a fourth place finish in the Premier League. I think it'll finish relatively boring almost in the Premier League. I think they'll do enough, but not really too much more than that, and that's why I think the other competitions, if they can just sort of quietly get into the top four spots, or top five, as it probably will be.
Yeah. I think.
Why not have a go at the other competitions at the same time?
I don't share your confidence. And while I don't disagree with what you said, that you look at all those teams and think, I don't know if any of them are going to get it together. It only takes 2 from about 10 teams and them to go on and have a really strong second half of the season. I think Chelsea could be capable of it, which is to slightly disagree with you. And the other one I look at the moment who are just slowly starting to build a bit of momentum is Newcastle. And I could envisage a scenario where those two, for instance, are really strong ends to the season and Liverpool do dip below them. So I think that, this has been a largely positive conversation, and not to go back to the conversation of last week, but this is where the performances need to improve in the Premier League now to ensure that doesn't slip, because I think it's actually going to take a relatively strong second half of the season now to secure one of those top 4/5 places.
Just to finish as well, I don't necessarily think that the performances in the league would be too separate to the performances in the FA Cup and the Champions League. Now, if Liverpool go all the way to Wembley and they have a pretty strong Champions League run, I'd be pretty happy in terms of the Premier League as well. I think there's a fairly strong correlation that if they're playing well in the FA Cup and they knock out a couple of teams there, if they go through in the Champions League, chances are that they're probably, general performance levels are higher in the league as well. So I suspect that if they do struggle to get into the top four, they're probably not going to win the FA Cup. I think that there's probably a correlation between the two things. If they're playing well in the league, that will lead them to the other things as well. But we'll see what happens. We'll see how close Manchester United and Chelsea in particular. Newcastle is a good shout as well. I think they obviously have lost to Manchester City this midweek, but they are a team that's got a decent amount of quality and depth and could put together a little bit of a run. But it sets it up nicely. And of course, we're still only halfway through January as well. So I'm sure we'll be talking plenty about transfers across the next few weeks as well. I'm sure next week's podcast will feature the Champions League as well. So we can get into a little bit more of that. Liverpool obviously playing in Marseille, which I think will be a good indicator of a little bit where they're up to as well at this moment in time. But we will leave it there for this week. Thanks to Michael for joining me and for you guys at home as well for watching and for listening. And we'll be back next week with the next Liverpool.com podcast.
This is the Blood Red podcast from the Liverpool Echo, giving you the inside track on all the big talking points from Anfield.